Welcome to our Zoom lessons on the writings of the Apostle Paul. My name is Jamie Knapp, and in this lesson, we will look at Philemon. Let's begin by sharing the screen. And let's start with a map. Again, Paul is here in Rome as a prisoner, and he's writing letters back to this area, Ephesians and Colossians, and in today's lesson to Philemon, who is an individual who lives in Colossae. All right, let's switch to a different screen and let's share the PowerPoint slides. We've been looking at the prison epistles, which include Ephesians, Colossians, today's lesson on Philemon, and then one more letter to the church in Philippi, known as Philippians. In the lesson on Ephesians, I provided some details about how Paul had become a prisoner in Jerusalem and been bounced around the legal system there and the court system in that area, appealed to Caesar, and then was sent to Rome by ship and kept under house arrest in Rome. He was a prisoner. He was not living in a dungeon or in a prison cell. He was in a private residence, but he had a Roman soldier at his side 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So he was not able to move about freely. He was able, though, to receive visitors. They could bring food to him. They could bring writing material. They could bring updates from the various churches where he had preached. And so he certainly was a prisoner. He was not a dungeon or prison cell prisoner, but he certainly was limited in what he was able to do and where he was able to be. The letter to Philemon is the shortest letter written by Paul. It only has 25 verses. And so when we talk about Philemon, often we don't say Philemon 1:17 or Philemon chapter 1, verse 6. We simply say Philemon 7 or Philemon 23. It might be worth pointing out at this juncture that when Paul wrote his letters, he did not write them with chapters and verses. Those came later, and they're very helpful to us when we study the Bible because, say, for instance, we're studying in 2 Corinthians. If we're trying to focus on something in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 17, instead of saying, well, go to kind of the middle of 2 Corinthians and then kind of move towards the end, but not quite to the end of the letter, and then back up just a little bit, we're simply able to say, go to chapter 9, verse 14, or go to chapter 3, verse 21. It's generally believed that the first English Bible to have chapters and verses was the Geneva Bible, which was published in 1560. And so since then, most Bibles that we have access to have the chapters and verses, which are very helpful to us as we try to study. So this is the shortest letter written by Paul, 25 verses. It's addressed to an individual, a man by the name of Philemon, who lives in Colossae and who is a Christian. And it focuses on a personal matter. Philemon is a companion letter to Colossians. And you can see this by looking at the end of Colossians chapter 4 and the end of Philemon. You see names like Tychicus, Epaphras, Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke. These are individuals who were with Paul in Rome. And Paul sends greetings on behalf of these individuals to the church in Colossae. He also sends greetings from these individuals to Philemon. Tychicus is an important name because he was the mailman. He was the courier, the one who was going to carry the letters to Ephesus, to Colossae, and to Philemon. And there's one more name of interest to us. We were introduced to Onesimus at the end of Colossians. Colossians 4, verse 9. Paul mentions Onesimus and doesn't talk a whole lot about him, and then moves on. Well, Onesimus was going to travel with Tychicus to deliver the letters. He was going to go to Ephesians and to Ephesus rather, he was going to go to Colossae. So he would be delivering the letters, including the letter to Philemon. And the reason this is important is because Onesimus was a runaway slave. He had run away from Philemon who lived in Colossae. And so Onesimus was going to have to face Philemon for the first time since he had run away. How far in the past Onesimus had run away is unclear. How he made it to Rome, which was a long way from Colossae, is unclear. How he became acquainted with Paul is unclear. But what we do know from verse 10 of Philemon is that Onesimus found Paul in Rome and they became very close. Onesimus became a Christian, and Onesimus became very helpful to Paul. It's quite possible that he ran errands for Paul. He helped find people and he helped gather materials, maybe food that Paul needed. And so Onesimus was very, very, very helpful to Paul. But along the way, Paul became aware that Onesimus was a runaway slave. And so Paul faced a dilemma, and that was, what do I do here? Onesimus is very, very helpful to me. I would love to keep him with me in Rome. Should I do that? Or should I send him back to Colossae, to his owner, Philemon, who was a brother in Christ? Paul decided that the right thing to do was to send Onesimus back to Philemon. But he didn't send him empty-handed. Paul wrote a very personal letter to Philemon on behalf of Onesimus. What's in the letter? Well, there are personal greetings in the first 7 verses from Paul to Philemon. And then there are some greetings from some other individuals who are in Rome, sending their greetings to Philemon. But the heart and soul of the letter, what we might call the appeal, verses 8 through 22, is where Paul really gets into addressing the purpose of the letter. Paul says to Philemon, I could use my authority as an apostle to tell you what to do with Onesimus and how you should receive him back. But I would rather ask you to do that instead of telling you to do that. And so Paul asked, would you receive Onesimus back as you would receive me? And would you treat Onesimus the way you would treat me? Because even though Philemon was a Christian, and even though Onesimus was now a Christian, there was no guarantee that Philemon would treat Onesimus kindly when he came back. He was a runaway slave. It's also possible that Onesimus had stolen something from Philemon just before he ran away, because he had to have a way to pay to get to Rome, whether he walked all the way to Rome or got on a ship and made it to Rome. Onesimus was going to need money. And so it's possible he had stolen something from Philemon. And so Paul says, if Onesimus owes you anything, I'm good for it. I'll pay you back. And then Paul includes in verse 22 an interesting little, almost humorous verse where he says, and by the way, get my bed ready because I'm planning to come and see you. So that's the letter that Paul wrote to Philemon. Only 25 verses, so it's something that can be read very, very easily in a single setting. And it's the first letter we've come across that was not written to a church. It was written to a person, an individual, about a very personal matter. Well, that's our introduction to Philemon. I hope you'll take some time to read through this very brief letter this week. In our next lesson, we will focus on the final of the prison epistles, and that will be Philippians. I hope you can join us.